I am Carmen, 32 years old. Just 6 months ago, the ultimate act of betrayal by my own family changed my life forever. In the middle of my mother's funeral, while I was standing there in the freezing rain trying to process the fact that the woman who gave birth to me was gone, my stepfather looked me dead in the eye and told me to pack my trash and get out of his house. They laughed at me. My stepfather and my spoiled half-sister, standing over a fresh grave, mocking my salary and stripping away my dignity in front of half the town. But there was one massive detail they didn't know. They had no idea about the irrevocable trust, the hidden real estate empire, or the fact that the quiet, boring accountant they loved to abuse was secretly holding the strings to their entire financial existence. And right now, they are facing prison time and absolute bankruptcy, begging for a mercy I do not possess. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their lives piece by piece, hit that like button if you believe in absolute justice, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the day the storm broke. The rain came down in sheets the morning we buried my mother, Marissa. I stood by the open grave in a cheap charcoal suit, the fabric soaking through to my skin. I didn't cry. It wasn't because I didn't love my mother. I loved her in that complicated, oxygen-deprived way you love someone who never quite stood up for you, someone who let you take the fall so she could survive. But I didn't cry because something in the air that day smelled entirely wrong. It smelled like old secrets rotting through the wet earth. Arthur Knight stood right beside me. He was straight-backed, impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit that probably cost more than my entire college fund, looking every inch the devastated widower. He placed a heavy, manicured hand on my shoulder twice for the benefit of the onlookers. I stepped away both times. The coldness radiating from him was nothing new, but today, it had a sharper edge. Father Joseph Schneider performed the service. He was a small man, nearing 70, with liver-spotted hands and a voice that wavered over the scriptures. But his eyes never wavered. They kept finding me through the sea of black umbrellas. It was not the kind of comforting glance a priest gives a grieving daughter. It was something else. It was pure, unadulterated guilt with nowhere to go. As the mourners began dispersing toward their cars, Father Schneider stepped directly into my path. He grabbed my elbow with a grip that bruised. He pulled me away from the crowd, dragging me toward the shadowy overhang of the vestry door. "Your mother confessed something before she died," he whispered, his breath shallow and frantic. "You are not who you think you are, Carmen." I almost laughed. I thought it was some kind of spiritual metaphor. But he wasn't smiling. He shoved a heavy, sealed manila envelope into my hands. "Your real birth certificate is inside," Father Schneider said, his eyes darting toward the parking lot where Arthur's black Mercedes was idling. "Don't open it here. Don't go home." He pressed a small, laminated card against the envelope. "Cedar Hills Storage, Locker 9. Go tonight. Alone." There is more inside. Everything she couldn't say while she was living. Before I could even process the weight of the paper in my hands, my phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text from Arthur. "Carmen, don't listen to anyone at the church. Come straight home. We need to talk." I looked from the glowing screen to the terrified face of the priest, and then down at the thick envelope. I slipped everything into my inner pocket, zipped my coat, and walked out into the downpour toward my battered sedan. Sitting in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, I felt the familiar weight of my childhood pressing down on my chest. For as long as I could remember, I was the ghost in my own home. Arthur was a prominent family lawyer, obsessed with country club memberships, HOA meetings, and projecting the perfect image. My mother was his beautiful, fragile accessory. And then there was Chloe. Chloe was my half-sister, Arthur's biological daughter. She was the golden child. I was the scapegoat. The division was not subtle, it was an undisputed law of gravity in our house. Chloe got brand new cars, unlimited credit cards, and praise just for breathing. I got handed the blame for every broken vase, every missing dollar, every bad mood that swept through the house. I was forced to get a part-time job at a grocery store when I was 16 just to buy my own winter coats. I remember a Thanksgiving dinner when I was 17. I had spent weeks applying for a partial scholarship because Arthur refused to co-sign a loan for me. I left the application on the kitchen counter. Chloe found it, laughed at the essay I wrote, and literally tore it in half because she needed scratch paper to write down a phone number. When I confronted her, my mother rushed into the kitchen, grabbed my arm, and hissed, "Give it a rest, Carmen. You know your sister is sensitive. Just print another one. Don't ruin the holiday." That was my life. I learned very early on that obedience and silence would not save me. They just made me an easier target. So, I stopped asking for love. I started building armor. If you have ever felt like the invisible child in your own family, the one who carries all the burdens while someone else gets all the glory, hit the subscribe button right now. You are not alone, and this story is for you. I didn't drive home. I sat in my freezing car and let the memories of their financial and emotional abuse wash over me. It wasn't just about missing out on affection, it was a systematic campaign to keep me at the bottom. When I graduated high school, I asked Arthur for a fraction of the college fund my mother had supposedly set up before she married him. He sat in his leather recliner, swirled his bourbon, and told me that fund was depleted. He said I just wasn't smart enough to waste an investment on, and I should look into trade school or waitressing. 2 days later, Chloe failed her college entrance exams. Arthur bought her a brand new Porsche to cheer her up. I moved out the next week. I worked 3 jobs, put myself through a grueling accounting program, and learned the intricate, cold beauty of forensic accounting. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not play favorites. Numbers do not manipulate you at the Thanksgiving table. Over the years, I built a wall of pure pragmatism between myself and my family. But the memory that truly killed the last shred of hope I had for my mother happened 3 years ago. I caught a severe case of pneumonia and ended up hospitalized for a week. I was entirely alone, terrified, and struggling to breathe. I called my mother, begging her to come sit with me for just an hour. She promised she would. She never showed up. Later that night, I checked social media and saw photos of her, Arthur, and Chloe at a luxury ski resort. My mother sent a single text the next day. "Arthur had this trip planned for months, Carmen. You know how he gets. The nurses are paid to take care of you. Stop being so dramatic." That was the exact moment the daughter inside me died. The grief I felt today at her funeral wasn't for the woman who died, it was the final echo of a mother I never actually had. I put the car in drive. Cedar Hill Storage sat on the gritty east edge of town. It was a miserable compound of gray corrugated metal, surrounded by a chain-link fence and flickering security lights that threw long, nervous shadows across the wet pavement. I arrived just past 11 at night. The attendant in the booth was watching something on his phone, earbuds firmly in place. He waved me through the rusted gate without so much as a glance in my direction. The rain drummed heavily against the metal roof as I walked down the second row. Locker 9. The laminated card Father Schneider gave me had a small, flat brass key taped to the back. I peeled the tape away, slid the key into the padlock, and turned it. With a loud, grinding screech, I pushed the rolling metal door upward. The air inside smelled like dust and dried paper. I clicked on my phone's flashlight. Sitting perfectly centered on the concrete floor was a black duffel bag, a heavy fireproof lockbox, and a framed photograph wrapped in brown butcher paper. I knelt down on the cold floor and unwrapped the photograph first. It was a picture of 2 people I had never seen before in my life. A young man and a woman, standing on the edge of a large lake, laughing into the camera. The woman was undeniably my mother, but younger, brighter, untouched by Arthur's shadows. The man had his arm around her. I stared at his face. He had my exact jawline. My dark eyes. Even the slightly crooked bridge of his nose mirrored mine. I set the frame down with a trembling hand and tore open the envelope Father Schneider had given me. The birth certificate was an original, the state seal raised and heavy under my thumb. Name, Carmen Elise Robertson. Mother, Marissa and Robertson. Father, Brent Thomas Robertson. Not Knight. Robertson. I wasn't Arthur's stepdaughter from a brief, forgotten affair, which was the story I had been fed my entire life. I had a completely different last name. A completely different history. I dragged the heavy fireproof box toward me and popped the latches. It was packed to the brim. It took me over an hour, sitting on the freezing concrete, reading by the harsh white light of my phone, to understand the magnitude of the lie I had been living. There were letters between my mother and a woman named Amber Dean. There was a copy of a last will and testament belonging to Brent Robertson, dated over 30 years ago. It explicitly named me, his daughter Carmen, as the primary heir to the Robertson estate. Attached was an old appraisal valuing the estate's real estate holdings at over $4 million. Then, I found his death certificate. Cause of death, accidental drowning. Stapled to the back of the death certificate was a piece of hotel stationery. The handwriting belonged to my mother. The ink was faded, but the words were a punch to the throat. Arthur knows he arranged it. The accident on the lake was not an accident. He took Brent's life, and then he took everything else. If I am gone before you read this, do not trust Arthur. Go find Amber Dean. She was there. She saw the second boat. She has been waiting. I leaned back against the corrugated metal wall and let the silence of the storage unit swallow me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My chest was tight, but my mind was moving with the terrifying precision of a machine suddenly plugged into a high-voltage current. I catalogued the facts. My real name was Carmen Robertson. My real father had been murdered. The man I had called my stepfather for 32 years had orchestrated his death, married the terrified widow, legally adopted the toddler to control the narrative, and buried the truth beneath decades of psychological torment and luxury cars. There was a witness. Amber Dean. I pulled out my phone, opened a secure browser, and began searching. The sun was just barely breaking through the storm clouds when I finally pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of Arthur's estate. The house was a sprawling monstrosity of stone and glass, a monument to a man who measured his worth by the envy of his neighbors. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the grand foyer. I expected the heavy, somber silence of a grieving household. Instead, I heard the clinking of china and the low murmur of a business meeting coming from the formal dining room. I walked quietly down the hall. Sitting at the long mahogany table was Arthur, looking remarkably refreshed. Next to him was Chloe, scrolling through her phone, and on Arthur's other side sat Evelyn, his young, razor-sharp executive assistant who spent more time in Arthur's private office than at her own desk. Spread out across the table were blueprints, financial portfolios, and legal documents. Less than 24 hours after my mother went into the ground, they were liquidating her memory. Arthur looked up. His eyes narrowed, stripping away the benevolent widower mask he wore for the public. "Where have you been, Carmen? I texted you to come straight home." "I took a drive," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. My hand was resting inside my coat pocket. My thumb pressed the record button on my phone. Evelyn smirked, sipping her coffee. Chloe didn't even look up from her screen. She was probably out sulking. Typical. Arthur stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Well, since you're finally here, we can handle this efficiently. Sit down." I didn't move. I stood at the end of the table, watching them. "Your mother's passing means we are making some immediate structural changes to the household and the finances," Arthur said smoothly, the tone he used when shredding opposing counsel in a divorce settlement. "Chloe is taking over the master suite. Evelyn is moving into Chloe's old room to assist me full-time with the transition. Which means your room is being converted into an expanded walk-in closet for your sister." He slid a thick stack of stapled papers down the polished wood toward me. I expect you to have your things packed and be off the property by tomorrow morning, he continued, not a trace of hesitation in his voice. The vehicle you're currently driving is registered under my company. You'll leave the keys on the counter. In exchange for your prompt departure, I have prepared a severance agreement. Sign this renunciation of any claims to your mother's estate, and I will write you a check for $5,000 to help you secure a cheap apartment. I looked at the document. It was a full legal waiver. He was kicking me out into the rain, stealing the car out from under me, and attempting to buy my silence and my birthright for the price of a used sofa. You're evicting me, I stated. The day after my mother's funeral. Chloe finally looked up, rolling her eyes. Oh, stop playing the victim, Carmen. You're 32 and you work some boring desk job. You're a leech. Dad is being generous, offering you a dime. Take the money and go back to whatever pathetic life you came from. Arthur tapped an expensive pen on the table. Sign the paper, Carmen. You have always been a heavy burden on this family. A difficult, ungrateful child. It's time you stood on your own 2 feet. Don't make me bring my legal team into this. You know you can't afford to fight me. The absolute audacity of the man. He was sitting in a house bought with my father's blood, wearing a Rolex purchased with stolen funds, telling me I was the burden. The rage inside me didn't boil over, it froze into absolute, unbreakable ice. I didn't argue. I didn't scream about fairness. I reached out, picked up the pen, and looked Arthur dead in the eyes. I need time to review the terms, I said calmly. I'll pack my things. I turned my back on them and walked upstairs. I didn't pack clothes. I didn't take a single thing Arthur had ever purchased for me. I packed my laptop, my forensic accounting software drives, my tax records, and the few photos of my mother I had. I hauled my old suitcase down the stairs, walked straight past the dining room, threw the keys to the sedan on the marble floor, and walked out the front door into the freezing morning air. I called an Uber. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of a Prius, watching the gates of the estate close behind me. I wasn't homeless. I wasn't broken. I was a loaded weapon, and Arthur Knight had just pulled the trigger. I directed the driver to a nondescript apartment complex across town. I walked up to the 3rd floor and pounded on the door of 3B. Drew Livingston opened the door. Drew was my oldest friend, a former military intelligence officer who now ran a private research and investigation firm. He took one look at my soaking wet clothes and the terrifying calm on my face. How bad? Drew asked, stepping aside to let me in. We need coffee, I said, dragging my suitcase inside. And I need your secure servers. We're going hunting. I unzipped my duffel bag and emptied the contents of locker 9 across his kitchen island. I laid out the birth certificate, the old will, the death certificate, and my mother's note. Then, I pulled out my own laptop, booting up the tracking software I used to trace shell companies and offshore accounts. For 32 years, Arthur looked at me and saw a victim. He forgot that the victim grew up to be an apex predator in the financial sector. He thinks he evicted an annoying stepdaughter, I told Drew, my eyes scanning a 30-year-old property deed. He doesn't realize he just declared war on the legal owner of his entire life. Drew didn't ask useless questions. He made a pot of black coffee, cracked his knuckles, and sat down beside me. We worked through the night, cross-referencing public records, old property tax filings, and corporate registries. By dawn, we had our first major breakthrough. The waterfront property that Arthur had used to launch his elite real estate portfolio wasn't a clean purchase. Before my father died, he had placed that massive parcel of land into an irrevocable trust. The beneficiary of that trust was Carmen Elise Robertson. Me. Arthur had forged my mother's signature, appointed himself as the financial guardian of a non-existent stepchild, and illegally leveraged the trust to build his empire. He built a house of cards on stolen dirt, Drew murmured, staring at the screen. But fraud is hard to prove after 3 decades without a witness. We have a witness, I said, picking up my mother's note. Amber Dean. Find her. It took Drew's tracking software 4 hours to locate her. Amber Dean was living in a quiet, heavily wooded suburb 2 hours away, maintaining a practically invisible digital footprint. No social media, cash-only transactions for major purchases. She lived like a woman who was constantly checking her rearview mirror. I rented a car and drove out to see her that afternoon. Amber lived in a small, meticulously kept cabin. When I knocked on the door, she didn't ask who it was. She opened it slowly. She was in her early 60s, her hair graying at the temples, but her eyes were sharp. She looked at my face, my jawline, and let out a long, shaky breath. "You have his eyes," she whispered. She stepped back and let me in. Sitting at her kitchen table, Amber finally unburdened herself of the secret she had carried for 30 years. She had been my father's business partner and closest friend. She told me about the missing funds, the forged signatures they had started noticing right before he died. And then, she told me about the lake. "I was on the shoreline that day," Amber said, wrapping her hands tightly around a mug of tea. "Your father took his boat out to clear his head. I saw a second boat approach him. I couldn't see faces, but I recognized the registration numbers. It was a boat registered to a shell company Arthur had just set up. I saw a struggle. I saw your father go into the water. The second boat sped off. Your father never surfaced." "Did you go to the police?" I asked, my voice tight. "I did," she said bitterly. "I spoke to a detective named Harris. He wrote down everything I said. 2 days later, my apartment was ransacked. A dead dog was left on my front porch. Detective Harris called me and told me I was a hysterical woman seeing things, and if I pushed it, I might suffer an accident myself. I ran. Your mother knew, Carmen. But she was terrified. Arthur threatened to take you away if she ever spoke up." Amber stood up, walked over to a floorboard near the fireplace, pried it up, and pulled out a dusty, leather-bound ledger. "I didn't run empty-handed," she said, sliding the ledger across the table. "These are the original transaction records. The proof that Arthur was embezzling from Brent before the murder." I placed my hand on the ledger. It felt incredibly heavy. "Amber, if I take this to court, will you testify under oath?" She looked at me without a single ounce of fear. "I have been waiting 30 years to destroy that man. Just point me to the witness stand." I drove back to the city with the ledger secured in my passenger seat. The emotional puzzle was complete. Now, I needed the absolute heaviest legal hammer in the state to drive the nail in. I called Sophia Benson. Sophia was a shark. She was a senior estate attorney who specialized in tearing apart fraudulent trusts, and she owed me a massive favor after my forensic team saved her main client from a multi-million-dollar tax trap last year. I met Sophia in her high-rise office downtown. I laid the entire timeline out on her glass desk: the birth certificate, the ledger, the irrevocable trust documents, and Amber's recorded statement. Sophia read through the files in absolute silence. When she finally looked up, her eyes were gleaming with professional ruthlessness. "Carmen," Sophia said slowly. "If Arthur executed these transfers under false representation, and this ledger proves he did, the entire chain of title is void. Going back 30 years. Every dollar he made off that land, every house he bought, every company he invested in using those funds, it's poisoned fruit. It legally belongs to the Robertson Trust. It belongs to you." "I want it all frozen," I said. "I don't want him to be able to buy a cup of coffee without my permission." "I can file the injunctions under seal," Sophia smiled, a terrifying, beautiful smile. "He won't know his accounts are locked until his credit cards start declining." But I had one more weapon up my sleeve. A weapon Arthur couldn't possibly anticipate. My phone buzzed. It was an unrecognized number. I answered it. "Carmen?" It was Wade Gomez, Arthur's sleazy junior lawyer. His voice dripped with condescension. Arthur noticed you didn't sign the severance agreement before you vanished. We need that finalized. If you make this difficult, I will tie you up in litigation so fast you won't be able to afford groceries. I smiled into the phone. Wade, do you actually know what I do for a living? You're a number cruncher at some mid-level firm, Wade scoffed. I'm a forensic accountant, I corrected him smoothly. And as of last month, I was promoted to senior partner at Vanguard Financial Auditing. There was a dead silence on the line. Vanguard was the independent firm recently hired by the state board to audit Arthur's law practice. He had been complaining about the invasive audit for weeks, completely unaware that the annoying stepdaughter he just kicked out was the apex predator holding the magnifying glass over his corrupt books. Tell Arthur I don't want his $5,000, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. Tell him to keep his checkbook handy. He's going to need it. I hung up, blocked the number, and looked at Sophia. The storm was fully primed. It was time to unleash it. 6 long, grueling months passed. For half a year, I vanished completely from Arthur's radar. I changed my phone number, moved to a high-security loft downtown, and buried myself in the intricate, cold-blooded geometry of forensic auditing. Arthur didn't come looking for me. In his mind, I was exactly what I had always been, a pathetic, defeated nuisance who had finally been chased out into the cold. He was so incredibly arrogant that he didn't even bother to check the public registry when the state board mandated an independent audit of his law firm's escrow accounts. He just assumed his money and his country club handshakes would keep him insulated from the consequences of his own greed. He was wrong. The trap was fully set, and the bait was Arthur's own massive ego. The occasion was the 30th anniversary of the Knight Legal Group. Arthur wasn't the kind of man to celebrate quietly. He rented out the grand ballroom at the Oakmont Country Club, the most exclusive and ridiculously expensive venue in the county. It was a place where initiation fees cost more than most people's mortgages, and the parking lot looked like a luxury car dealership. I arrived right at the peak of the evening, just as the sun dipped below the manicured golf greens. I didn't pull up in my old, sputtering sedan. I stepped out of a sleek, black town car hired for the evening. I wasn't wearing the cheap charcoal suit from my mother's funeral. I was wearing a tailored, razor-sharp designer suit in deep midnight blue, my hair pulled back into a severe, elegant twist. I looked like money. Old, quiet, dangerous money. The kind of money Arthur had spent his entire life desperately trying to imitate. I walked past the valet stand and straight through the massive oak doors of the country club. Nobody stopped me. When you walk with absolute, terrifying purpose, people tend to just step out of your way. The ballroom was a sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and the city's most influential politicians, judges, and real estate developers. It was a sickening display of wealth built entirely on a foundation of my father's stolen legacy. Across the room, I spotted Chloe. She was holding court near an ice sculpture, dripping in diamonds that Arthur had purchased using funds siphoned from my inheritance. She was loudly bragging to a group of young associates about her brand new Porsche 911, laughing that high, piercing laugh that used to make me shrink into the walls of my childhood home. And then, I saw Arthur. He was standing on a raised dais near the front of the room, a microphone in one hand and a glass of expensive bourbon in the other. He was wearing a custom tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly styled. Evelyn, his assistant and worst-kept secret, was hovering right behind his shoulder, looking like a vulture in a silk evening gown. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned myself perfectly in Arthur's line of sight, right in the middle of the crowded floor. It took him exactly 4 minutes to notice me. I watched the realization hit him. First, confusion clouded his features, followed almost immediately by a flash of absolute, venomous anger. He whispered something to Evelyn, who whipped her head around to glare at me. In a normal world, a man in his position would have sent security to quietly escort an unwanted guest out the back door to avoid a scene. But Arthur was a malignant narcissist. He couldn't just remove me, he had to destroy me. He had to prove to a room full of the city's elite that he was the benevolent king and I was the ungrateful peasant begging for scraps. He tapped the microphone. A sharp squeal echoed through the ballroom, and the orchestra immediately stopped playing. Hundreds of faces turned toward the dais. The room went dead silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur's voice boomed through the speakers, dripping with a thick, syrupy layer of fake compassion. "I apologize for the interruption, but it seems we have an unexpected, though tragic, guest tonight." The crowd parted slightly, leaving me standing alone in a clearing of expensive evening wear. Chloe pushed her way to the front, her eyes widening in disgust. "Many of you knew my late wife, Marissa," Arthur continued, pressing his hand to his chest as if the grief were physically hurting him. "And some of you may know her daughter from a previous, unfortunate relationship. Carmen." He pointed directly at me. The whispers started instantly. Eyes raked up and down my tailored suit, trying to reconcile the elegant woman standing before them with the narrative Arthur was spinning. "Carmen has struggled her entire life," Arthur said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Mental instability, financial ruin, and inability to hold down a stable career. When Marissa passed, I tried to offer this young woman a lifeline. A generous severance to help her get on her feet, despite the immense burden she has always been on my family." He gestured to Wade Gomez, his sweaty junior partner, who hurried forward carrying a familiar manila folder. Arthur took the folder and pulled out the legal waiver. The same waiver he tried to force me to sign the morning he threw me out into the rain. "I have carried the weight of this family for 30 years, Arthur projected, looking around the room to gather sympathy from the judges and developers. "But I cannot allow my firm's anniversary to be disrupted by a shakedown. Carmen, I have the settlement papers right here. I am offering you $10,000 tonight. Out of the goodness of my heart. Come up here, sign the waiver relinquishing any ridiculous claims you think you have, take the check, and leave my family in peace." Chloe let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "Just take the money and leave, Carmen. You're embarrassing yourself." The absolute audacity was breathtaking. He was trying to publicly humiliate me into signing away a multi-million-dollar estate. He had boxed me in, assuming I would crumble under the weight of hundreds of staring eyes. He thought the public pressure would break me, just like it had broken my mother. I didn't shrink. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I handed the glass to a very confused waiter, adjusted the cuffs of my suit, and began to walk toward the dais. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The sound was sharp, steady, and entirely unafraid. I walked up the 3 carpeted steps to the stage and stopped inches away from Arthur. I looked at the waiver in his hand. Then, I looked up into his eyes. For the first time in his miserable life, I saw a flicker of genuine uncertainty behind his arrogant stare. He realized, in that split second, that the woman standing in front of him was not his victim anymore. "I'm not here for your charity, Arthur," I said, my voice carrying clearly without a microphone. But I wanted the whole room to hear. So, I reached out and gently took the microphone from his suddenly rigid hand. I turned to face the crowd. The trap had been sprung. It was time to close the jaws. I thought the worst part of my life was being his scapegoat. I was so incredibly wrong. The worst part was realizing I had the power to stop him all along. "Good evening, everyone," I said into the microphone. My voice was crisp, professional, and devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a surgeon about to make a very deep cut. "Arthur is right about one thing. We do have some unfinished business regarding my mother's estate. But he is a little confused about the power dynamic in this room." Arthur's face flushed a deep, angry purple. "Security! Get her off this stage right now," he hissed, lunging for the microphone. I stepped back smoothly, maintaining my grip. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Walking through them was Sophia Benson, looking like a legal executioner in a sharp gray trench coat, flanked by Drew Livingston and 3 uniformed state marshals carrying thick, sealed boxes of documents. The crowd gasped and parted like the Red Sea. Even the country club security guards froze, intimidated by the presence of the marshals. You see, I continued, projecting my voice over the rising murmur of the crowd, Arthur introduced me as an unstable woman who can't hold down a career. Allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Carmen Robertson. I am a certified fraud examiner, and as of last month, I am the senior partner at Vanguard Financial Auditing. The name dropped like a live grenade. Vanguard was the firm appointed by the State Ethics Board to audit the McKnight Legal Group. Several of the lawyers and politicians in the room instantly stiffened, suddenly realizing that the woman standing on stage had unfettered access to all of Arthur's dirty financial secrets. Arthur physically stumbled back, his expensive bourbon splashing onto his shoes. That's impossible. You're a low-level clerk. I haven't been a clerk for 7 years, Arthur, I said coldly. I gestured to the massive projector screen behind the dais, which had been displaying the law firm's logo. Drew marched over to the AV control desk, plugged in a heavily encrypted flash drive, and hit a button. The firm's logo vanished. In its place, a massive, brilliantly colored flowchart illuminated the ballroom. It detailed 30 years of aggressive embezzlement, wire fraud, and money laundering. Over the past 6 months, my team has conducted a comprehensive forensic teardown of the McKnight Legal Group's escrow accounts, I explained, gesturing to the screen like a professor giving a lecture. We found over $6 million in misappropriated client funds. Arthur, it seems you've been using your client settlements as a personal piggy bank to fund your country club dues, Evelyn's luxury condo downtown, and, of course, your daughter's brand new Porsche. Chloe shrieked from the crowd. Shut up. You're lying. Daddy, make her stop. It gets worse, I said, cutting over her voice. I turned back to Arthur, who was now sweating profusely, his hands trembling. You see, Arthur didn't just steal from his clients. He stole his entire life. Sophia walked up to the edge of the stage and handed me a certified legal document. I held it up for the room to see. 32 years ago, my biological father, Brent Robertson, placed a massive waterfront development parcel into an irrevocable trust. The sole beneficiary of that trust was his daughter. Me. I stared directly into Arthur's panicking eyes. When my father died under highly suspicious circumstances, Arthur married my terrified mother, forged her signature, and illegally leveraged that trust to build his real estate empire. Every single dollar you have ever made, Arthur, stems from a fraudulent transfer. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. The judges and developers in the crowd were actively inching away from Arthur, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive blast zone of his crimes. That's slander. Wade Gomez yelled from the front row, though his voice cracked with panic. You have no proof of those transfers. I have the original handwritten ledgers, I fired back, my eyes locking onto Wade until he physically shrank back. And yesterday morning, a superior court judge reviewed those ledgers and agreed with my assessment. The chain of title is entirely void. Which means Arthur McKnight doesn't own his law firm. He doesn't own his house. He doesn't even own the watch currently ticking on his wrist. I took a step closer to Arthur. He looked completely hollowed out, the arrogant facade shattering into a million pathetic pieces. You can't evict me from my own property, Arthur, I whispered, though the microphone picked up every chilling syllable. You are standing on my dirt. But I wasn't done. Financial ruin was the appetizer. The main course was justice for the ghost who had haunted me my entire life. Financial fraud has a statute of limitations, I announced to the paralyzed room. But murder does not. I looked at Drew. He tapped his keyboard. The flowchart on the screen disappeared, replaced by a stark black background with a soundwave graphic. A crackly, audio recording began to play over the massive concert speakers. It was the voice of a dying man. My name is Detective Raymond Harris, the voice wheezed, punctuated by the heavy sound of an oxygen machine. 30 years ago, I investigated the drowning of Brent Robertson. It wasn't an accident. I took a bribe of $50,000 from Arthur McKnight to bury the eyewitness testimony of Amber Dean. Arthur ran Brent's boat down. I helped him cover it up. I have terminal cancer now. I'm making this statement to clear my conscience. The recording clicked off. The absolute horror radiating from the crowd was palpable. People were covering their mouths. A few women physically rushed toward the exit. Arthur dropped his glass. It shattered against the dais. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an ally, a friend, a politician he had bought. But there was no one. He was completely, utterly isolated. You killed him, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. You killed my father, you terrorized my mother into an early grave, and you spent 30 years trying to convince me I was nothing. But you forgot one crucial detail, Arthur. You left the accountant alive. And numbers never forget. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom, the flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers began to paint the darkness outside. The sirens wailed, growing louder and louder until they drowned out the classical music that had been playing softly in the lobby. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. It had crushed him to dust. The state marshals didn't wait for the local police. They moved in immediately, surrounding the dais. The lead marshal, a tall, unsmiling man, pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Arthur McKnight, the marshal said, his voice cutting through the chaos of the ballroom. You are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and suspicion of first-degree murder. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Arthur didn't fight. He couldn't. The shock had completely short-circuited his brain. He turned around, his shoulders slumped, looking like a deflated balloon. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. As the marshal yanked his arms back, the heavy, diamond-encrusted Rolex on his wrist scraped violently against the metal cuffs, leaving a deep, jagged scratch across the crystal face. It was a perfectly poetic detail. Carmen, please, Arthur begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine as they began to march him off the stage. I raised you. I put a roof over your head. You can't do this to your family. I didn't even blink. I just watched him. You aren't my family, Arthur. You were just a parasite. And your time is up. They marched him right down the center aisle of the ballroom. The elite members of the country club, the people he had spent his entire life trying to impress, turned their backs on him in absolute disgust. Meanwhile, panic was breaking out at the edges of the room. I caught sight of Evelyn, his loyal assistant and mistress, frantically trying to slip out the side exit. She had her purse stuffed tight, probably full of whatever petty cash and jewelry she could grab from the firm's safe. But Drew was already waiting for her at the door, blocking her path with a grim smile and a subpoena. Then, there was Chloe. She was standing near the ice sculpture, sobbing hysterically, mascara running down her face in thick black rivers. She was screaming at the country club manager, demanding that someone call her a private car. The manager just looked at her with pity and signaled for the valet. A moment later, the valet rushed in, looking panicked. Miss McKnight? The police have blocked the driveway. And, they're hooking your Porsche up to a tow truck. They said it's being seized as evidence of money laundering. Chloe let out a shriek that sounded like a dying animal. She ripped her platinum credit card out of her designer clutch and shoved it at the manager. Run my card. Call me a helicopter, call me an Uber Black, just get me out of here. The manager swiped the card. The machine beeped aggressively. Declined. Account frozen. She was utterly ruined. In the span of 20 minutes, the spoiled golden child had lost her car, her trust fund, her home, and her father. She looked across the room at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and disbelief. I gave her a slow, cold nod, and walked out of the ballroom. Exactly 1 month later, the dust had settled into hard, permanent concrete. Arthur was sitting in a county jail cell, denied bail by a judge who had once attended his dinner parties. The state had seized all of his assets. The firm was dissolved, and Wade Gomez was facing disbarment for his role in the cover-up. I was sitting in my new corner office at Vanguard, reviewing the final asset liquidation reports for the Robertson Trust, when the phone on my desk buzzed. It was front desk security. "Ms. Robertson? There is a young woman down here causing a scene in the lobby. She says her name is Chloe, and she insists she's your sister." I paused, looking out the massive window at the city skyline. "Send her up," I said quietly. A few minutes later, the heavy glass doors of my office swung open. Chloe stood there, and she looked completely unrecognizable. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a wrinkled sweatshirt and cheap leggings. Her hair was unwashed, and the arrogant sneer she had worn her entire life had been replaced by a desperate, hollow exhaustion. She walked into my office and immediately burst into tears, collapsing into one of the leather visitor chairs. "Carmen, you have to help me," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I have nothing. The state took the house. They seized my bank accounts. I'm sleeping on a friend's couch, and she's kicking me out tomorrow. I can't find a job. Nobody will hire me with my last name. Please. We're sisters. Blood is blood." I sat back in my chair, steepled my fingers, and looked at her. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, no triumph. Just a clinical, terrifying emptiness where my empathy for her used to live. "Blood is a biological accident, Chloe," I said, my voice smooth and level. "You stood over my mother's fresh grave and laughed at me. You told me I was a leech and ordered me to take a $5,000 bribe to disappear. You sat by and cheered while your father tried to erase my existence." "I didn't know he killed your dad," she cried, gripping the edge of my desk. "I swear I didn't know. I was just a kid when he did that." "You didn't know he was a murderer." "No," I agreed softly. "But you knew he was a monster to me. And you loved every single second of it, because my pain bought you a Porsche. You aren't sorry for what happened to me, Chloe. You're just terrified because the bank is closed, and you don't know how to survive in the real world." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She realized the psychological manipulation wasn't working. "I'm not your mother, Chloe. I will not coddle you, and I will not protect you from the consequences of your own complicity." I picked up my desk phone and pressed the button for security. "The exit is behind you. Do not ever contact me again." The security guard appeared at the door. Chloe looked at me one last time, realizing that the bridge wasn't just burned, the ashes had been scattered into the ocean. She stood up, her shoulders shaking, and walked out. The automatic glass doors slid shut behind her, sealing the tomb on my past forever. The first thing I did after seizing full control of the Robertson Trust was tear down the monument to my suffering. I hired a massive estate liquidator to empty out Arthur's sprawling mansion. Every piece of expensive, soulless furniture, every crystal chandelier, every ugly piece of modern art he had bought to impress his friends, it all went to auction. Then, I sold the massive waterfront property to a commercial developer. I didn't want a single brick of that toxic house. I wanted it erased from the earth. With the millions of dollars generated from the sale, I didn't buy sports cars or designer jewelry. I went straight to the bank and established the Brent Robertson Memorial Foundation. It was a massive, fully funded scholarship and grant program designed specifically for young women who were trying to escape financial abuse and toxic family environments. It provided full college tuition, housing stipends, and legal assistance for girls who were told they were too stupid, too burdensome, or too broken to succeed. I remember sitting in my lawyer's office, the autumn sunlight streaming through the windows, as I signed the very first check for the foundation. It was a six-figure sum to put 3 young women through an accounting program. As the ink dried on the paper, I felt a physical weight lift off my chest. It was a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying since I was a little girl hiding from Arthur's shouting. I smiled. It was the first genuine, unburdened smile of my entire adult life. My vengeance wasn't just about destroying Arthur. It was about taking the poison he had injected into my life and turning it into medicine for someone else. That evening, I didn't go home to an empty apartment. I went to a quiet, elegant Italian restaurant downtown. I had reserved a private table in the back. Waiting for me there were the only 3 people in the world who truly understood the war I had just won. Drew was there, ordering a dark beer and looking over a new case file. Sophia Benson was sitting across from him, sipping a glass of expensive red wine and laughing at something he said. And sitting at the head of the table, looking peaceful and radiant, was Amber Dean. I had hired her as the primary consultant for the Memorial Foundation, ensuring she would never have to worry about money or look over her shoulder ever again. As I sat down with them, passing the bread and pouring the wine, I looked around the table. This was it. This was my family. For 32 years, society tried to force-feed me the lie that family is strictly defined by blood. They tell you that you must forgive your abusers because they're still your parents, or she's still your sister. They tell you that setting boundaries is selfish, and that walking away is a failure of love. That is the most dangerous, toxic lie we are ever taught. Family is not a biological obligation. Blood does not give anyone the right to emotionally bankrupt you, to steal your future, or to treat you like a human shield for their own insecurities. True family is an action. It is the people who stand with you in the freezing rain. It is the people who help you dig through the dirt to find the truth. It is the people who celebrate your strength instead of being intimidated by it. I survived Arthur Knight not by forgiving him, but by accepting exactly who he was, and then using my own intelligence to systematically dismantle his power over me. I stopped waiting for the villain to apologize, and I became the hero of my own story. The quiet, boring accountant who learned how to weaponize the truth. To every woman out there watching this, if you are currently the scapegoat in your family, if you are being drained, belittled, or told you are the problem by people who refuse to look in the mirror, listen to me carefully. Stop trying to earn their love. You cannot heal in the same environment that is making you sick. Gather your strength, build your independence in the shadows, document everything, and when you are ready, walk away and never look back. Your success, your peace, and your absolute indifference to their existence is the most devastating revenge you can ever deliver. Have you ever faced something similar with your own toxic family? Have you ever had to draw a hard line in the sand to protect your own sanity? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and your courage helps someone else realize they aren't alone. And please, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Until next time, stay strong, stay sharp, and protect your peace at all costs.